Enjoy this two-part episode with SME CEO Mark Kramer. Mark shares the origin story of SME from his vantage point as the son of Ken Kramer, one of the founders of the company. We discussed everything from his summer jobs at the company while a teenager to how he rose from project engineer to ultimately take over for his dad in the early 2000s. The lengths that Mark's dad went to purchase the company back in the day is worth the price of admission. Here's part one of our conversation with SME CEO Mark Kramer. The first individual that I get to speak with is actually none other than your CEO, Mark Kramer. And Mark has, well, as we like to say, he has some history in this company. And so I'm excited to sit down with Mark today and learn a little bit more about SME's history. And the spoiler alert is that I actually sat down with him about a month ago, and we had a really deep dive conversation about all that he's done and really all that his father did to set SME up to be as successful as it is today. And I can't wait to tell this story because stories matter. And I think when you hear this origin story for SME, you will concur with me and agree that, man, I heard something today that I didn't hear before or I didn't know. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Mark Kramer to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great today, Randy. It's good to talk to you again.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, let's just jump right into it. As we said, and as I kind of teased, I'd love for you just to kind of tell, with some historical relevance, just your origin story there at SME. And then we'll get into talking a little bit about your dad as well.
Where do I start?
Well, let's go back to, I know you were spending some time in Arizona and then you came back and joined the company, but you actually, and I remember you telling me this, because you asked me, I said, when did you start working at SME? And you said, you mean for pay or just to work? Because I think you were put to work at SME when you were back in high school. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, probably more like junior high at that time. So, back in the early days of computers, right? I was working on an Apple II Plus and helping develop some software for one of the engineers here, who was our chief engineer. We're looking at different foundation and soil issues. So I had no idea what I was doing at the time, right? I was just, playing around with computers and trying to help them with a problem. So I didn't get paid, but I learned a lot, developed a relationship with somebody within the company. So that was a fun time looking back on it. I'd done some things before that as well, but not so much work. Used to hang out a lot. When my dad was in the office on the weekends, he was doing his work and he needed to keep an eye on me. So I used to run around and play in the labs in the back and do things that we can't do anymore for safety reasons.
Right.
Right. But back in the day, we used to have a lot of fun, especially down in our first office down in Detroit back in would have been, the early 70s.
So, and so it would be fair to say that you cut your teeth in this company from almost not day one, because that was when your dad was doing things before you got involved with it. But I mean, you really got a chance to get to understand this company from the ground up at an early age. What was it about? Because I mean, I remember following my grandfather to work from time to time on the weekends. He worked at the United Nations. I always wanted to go in there because I would get a chance to run around that big complex. What was it about coming into SME on the weekends with your dad that really drew you to that?
Yeah, great question. I think, part of it was just wanting to be around my dad and understand sort of what he was doing, because you really could never sort of see it or understand it without being there. And I wouldn't say I learned the business then. I really just got exposed to it, right? You get to, see him sitting at the desk reviewing reports, or, go out to a construction site and see him, talking with the contractors, or sit in the lab and see some of the things that were going on. So at that point, it was really just an exposure to what we did, but I really had no understanding. I, remember thinking back, sitting across from the desk from him going like, hey, what would I ask him? Like, I don't even know where to start. And I got to go to some conferences with him as a young adult and that. But again, really, I wouldn't say I learned really what we did because you just got snippets, right? You just got got to observe things, but it was really just an exposure. So
Yeah.
I don't think it was until college that I really understood, and then my first work experience where I really understood sort of the business, right? So I'd been exposed to it and had some understanding, but not really deep at that point.
Yeah. And you guys have been around for 50 plus years. And I'd love for you just to kind of tell the story about how your dad came about. He got introduced to the company and ultimately or acquired the company, if you will. But it didn't start out that way. A lot of times you talk to people and they're like, well, my father started this company. He didn't technically start SME, but he took it over fairly in fair short order, right? After 7 years of the company being in existence.
Yeah. So my father was working as a staff engineer, like many of our people, for a company called STS Consultants in Chicago. My dad was originally from Chicago, went to school in Detroit at the University of Detroit to play basketball and get his engineering degree. And he was back in Chicago working on the O'Hare expansion back then in the 60s. And they were looking at a big opportunity in Detroit and saw some opportunity to open up an office there. And so they created a joint venture called Soil and Materials Engineers at the time. And it was a joint venture between STS Consultants out of Chicago, which was the soil portion of the name, and a company out of Baltimore, which no longer exists, called Nerley, Bender and Stone. And they were concrete experts. And so that's how the name Soil and Materials Engineers came about. And we were formed as a company, as a joint venture in 1964. So we're almost 60 years in existence. And then my dad was actually sent to Detroit to be the first general manager, what we call now here at SME a regional office manager. And he ran the business for a while. And in the early 70s, I think it was around 72, he had a falling out or an issue with STS. Nerley, Bender and Stone by then was no longer involved. They had sold their stock after a few years, and STS was the primary owner. And then when they had this situation, my dad on a Saturday flew to Chicago to have a discussion with the CEO and the CFO. And there was an issue around whether or not staff were going to get money for bonuses. And he had been promised, or at least he thought he had been promised, that this money would come in. And he challenged the CFO, and the CFO told him what he said. And my dad did not agree. And so he made an ultimatum, said, hey, either, you go or I go, because we can't work together. And that's ultimately when my dad purchased the company or the rest of the stock from STS. A similar story to happen to a few other companies like us. So it was a tough time in the early 70s, and the companies were challenged. And that's really when sort of my dad could be called the founder at that point, right? But the company already existed, was already doing work, and we already had staff and that kind of thing. But he had took over at that point and became the owner of the company.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, and I guess it wouldn't be selling your dad short to say that for him, the real issue was the values and culture that he held so high that didn't allow him to want to be associated with individuals that were part of the company as well, which caused him to do that ultimatum and give that ultimatum. I mean, now that you look back, I mean, what is your reflection on that at that time and that experience that he had?
Yeah. So, I heard that story from him directly. And I also got this story sort of indirectly from other people who shared me their perspective on it. And, I look back, and it's definitely about values, right? He clearly had an issue with the CFO of that company and their values. And he thought he had a commitment and a promise, and it was broken. And, my dad, it's funny, back when he was still around, a lot of people said he was a benevolent dictator, right? He was in everything, and he made a lot of decisions, but he was also all about, the people and figuring out how to best take care of the team. And everything he did was And there's a lot of stories about how he took care of people, and he didn't ever talk about it. He didn't share it. It was sort of all below the radar, but he really wanted to make sure that the people were taken care of. And that, to me, this is just a great example where he, thought that they were going to get, money for year-end bonuses, and the company balked on that. And he felt like he was in a tough position because, he thought the team deserved their bonuses that year and thought they'd earned them. And the company was having a hard time. And so they didn't have the ability to pay or didn't want to pay. So, and when I look back on it, early on when I first got here, I don't think I understood that. But, now after going through, some challenging times and ups and downs and things, you understand that, it's important. And he really sort of brought those values into the company about, making sure that we all understood that how important the team members were and how we need to take care of them. And that, even in tough times, you have to figure out a way to deal with these challenges to make things right. And so when I look at it now, for him, though, I don't know that it was that big of a deal. I think that's just the way he was. He was like, right, wrong, it's pretty clear. Other people may be challenged by that, but it was pretty clear for him. So
no ambiguity for him whatsoever. So, and I know you also told me that your dad was a pretty good problem solver, and he understood what it meant to build relationships with clients, which is ultimately how SME was able to build their book of business and to expand the company. Because as SME grew, as they did great work, clients would come to them with new needs. And that's essentially how you develop so many, verticals of business within SME. I'd love for you to just talk about that a little bit and how your dad was instrumental in that. He had a photographic memory. So, from that perspective, there were a number of factors and a number of key components that your dad had as a leader that were really instrumental in helping SME grow.
Yeah, it's, I learned a lot when I first joined, and then, after he got sick, having a lot of conversation with, people that grew up with him, some of our clients that, had, done projects with him all over the country for, 20, 30 years. And, they shared a lot with me, and that, it was always interesting because you said it, he was really good at building relationships. My dad was, even though he was, again, I call him the benevolent dictator, people sort of feared him. But at the same time, there's all kinds of stories about people always saying how he helped them out. And the client said the exact same thing. I had a number of clients say, you don't understand how many times your dad got me out of a jam. I was on a project and we were having this problem, and your dad jumped in there and figured out how to solve the problem when other people were challenged by it. And I think my dad was, very intelligent. As you said, he had photographic memory. I, saw many occasions of that, but he wasn't the most technical engineer, right? He was really about just sort of solving things. And we talk about practical solutions now, and that's really what it was. He was able to take really complex things and figure out how to simplify them and work with the owners to solve these problems. And he was able to see through a lot of the things that other, I think, engineers wouldn't see. And so that was sort of the reputation that he built early on. And that was the kind of people I think that he attracted. When I reflect on, some of the key people that he had around him, when I took over, it was great because he had developed a great group of people who were very much thought like him and had the same values. And so when my father got sick and was no longer able to help us, the team didn't skip a beat. They just kept going on. And so, clearly he had figured out a way to instill sort of that culture in him with, building relationships, being that trusted advisor, providing practical solutions, being responsive, not over-engineering things. Sometimes as engineers, we get, people say things about being too conservative or that. I think that's one of the things that our clients appreciated with him and some of the others that we had here at the time. that's how our reputation got built. So.
Yeah. And I mean, gosh, your dad had some big shoes to fill, and you kind of came in and filled them. I would imagine that when you left and went off to kind of do your thing and then came back, did you recognize the same company that you came into when you were there, when you were a lot younger? Not really working there as an employee, but did it feel different for you?
That's an interesting question, right? So my experience, like through high school into college, I'd worked a summer after my freshman year as a technician out in the field. And, I experienced the company through going to some summer picnics and that kind of thing during that period. So when I came back, I went away to school out at Arizona State for 4 or 5 years, and then worked for about 6 years in North Carolina and Washington, D.C. When I came back, there was a lot of the same people, but yeah, the company had definitely grown up. I mean, we had moved buildings in that time. We were in a smaller building in Livonia, and we had moved to where our current headquarters are here in Plymouth. And I was really impressed with the new building and the facilities. I mean, the old place was nice, but when you compare it to Detroit, the original Detroit office, each of those were a significant step up. And the new place was really a step up and had a lot of new people. And, when I came in as a project engineer, I came in with a bunch of people. A number of them are still here. Some of those project engineers are now running offices and running parts of our operations. So yeah, it was, call it different, but yet the same. Some of the senior field guys, Frank Henderson, who ran our operations for a long time and was my dad's right-hand man and sat on our board for a long time. He was there before and after. Gary Motti, who's since retired. A lot of these people retired now, but they were people that I knew when I was a kid, and they were still there, when I came back. So it definitely felt different, but it felt very familiar, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And I think it speaks volumes to how your dad led and ran the company, because typically if you don't like where you're working, or if you're not, I mean, I know things were different a few generations ago, like your dad's generation, they didn't just jump from one job to another, right? And that's not me throwing shade at younger people nowadays who typically do take other jobs a little easier than people did back in the day. But it speaks volumes that nobody really left. I mean, they felt comfortable enough to stay with your dad and to catch the vision that he was sharing. And then that was a vision that you were able to pick up. And eventually, as you grew in your role within the company, you were able to take the company to a whole nother level. And I'd love for you just to kind of, I know when we talked originally, you likened it to the simple fact of looking at it through 2 different decades and dealing with the challenges. So you had the first decade of your leadership and then the second decade. And the first decade included the financial meltdown that everybody struggled with. But yet and still, because of the foundation that your dad built with SME, and because of the work that you had built with clients and the goodwill that you had built up, that you guys were able to sustain even through some difficult times, and you're the better for it today. I'd love for you just to kind of walk our listeners through just kind of your evolution as a leader in your own right.
Yeah, that's a interesting story. I'll try to boil it down, right? So, because it was 20 years in the making. So, I guess to frame the picture, right, it was October of 2001, right after September 11. My mom and I felt like something was up with my father. And I was, 34 at the time, I think. And my mom was a emergency room nurse and then a hospice nurse. And so, she understood health, and we thought something was up. And, we had him looked at the Mayo Clinic, and at first they thought he was okay. And on the second day, they did some more testing and realized that, he had something impacting him. And it turned out that he had a early form of dementia called Pick's disease. And so, talking with the doctors, his IQ was severely impacted and his photographic memory was gone. And so we had to quickly pivot and retire him at that point. He stayed around for a long time. We'd let him come in and that, but that was sort of the start of the journey. So, just imagine you're working with your father and, you realize he's sick and you're 34 years old and you got to jump in and figure it out. And I made the comment earlier about if it wasn't for the team that we had at the time, I think, it would have been really tough. We had a lot of great people and a lot of good positions, and they knew what they needed to do and they took care of it. And that first 10 years was really a struggle for me and a learning process, because I hadn't gone to school for business, had to learn on the fly. My father wasn't necessarily there to help me. I mean, I did get the benefit of the 5 or 6 years before that, spending, every day with him, learning and talking about the business. So I did get that education, which was very helpful, but I no longer had somebody to sort of rely on and ask questions of. So the first 10 years was a real challenge, a real learning. And that, I guess, made me who I was in terms of understanding what's important and understanding how bad things can get. My mom, relapsed with her alcoholism during that period. I had 3 young kids. So I was going through a lot. And so, when I reflect back, I'm, amazed that we got through that, but we did. And again, I give a lot of credit to the team at that point. They knew what they needed to do and they did it. And they really pulled together when we needed it. And, I think I helped along the way, but I certainly wasn't adding as much value as I probably could have if, things had been different. And then the second 10 years, and at the end of that 10 years, really, because that was 2001. So by 2009, we were in Michigan and dealing with the financial meltdown. And, as many of you experienced, it was a tough time. And we were really fortunate in so many ways to get through that. And we had some tough times, but we were profitable every year. And, we shrunk a little bit, but we, continued to grow after that. And so it was a tough period, but we learned a lot about ourselves and what we were capable of and what we could survive. The second 10 years was a lot different because we, it started sort of after the financial meltdown, and we were, trying to figure out where we wanted to go. And, in 2012, we bought a company, we did some things. And then I was working with an executive coach at the time, and, he kept reminding me, it's like, hey, you can only take this place as far as you are capable. He said, you better work on your capability, right? You better continue to grow and learn. And so in that second period, I spent a lot more time learning and developing myself and working with the team and focusing much less on day-to-day, call it solving the problem right in front of me, and focusing more on building the team and building myself, and really working on how do we have the best team available and how do we have, good strategies that can help us sort of work smarter, not harder in what we're doing, and really focus on, taking care of the clients we want to take care of rather than just, chasing things. And so over those second 10 years, I think as a team, we grew a lot. We developed, our strategic planning process and our leadership development program and our university that we use for training, and we developed the current organization and we really grew. I mean, especially from about 2013, 14 through 2020, we had very steady, sustained growth at higher levels than before. So clearly something was happening. I know, the economy certainly helped, but we were outpacing even the economy for many of those years. So yeah, it was an interesting period, both those. I don't think I would have been successful in the second 10 years if I hadn't experienced the first 10 years, because it, made me cautious and made me humble, right? Because you realize how important certain things are and how important other things are. And so it's easy to reflect back on it, though. It was hard going through both those periods, but looking back, it's, pretty clear to me, the team was great all the way through, but I learned a lot about myself. And I think in the second period, I was able to add much more value to the team than I was in the first 10 years.
Would it be fair to say you also held the moniker of Chief People Officer in terms of not only developing yourself, but really encouraging others to step out of their comfort zone and expand their horizons as well?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely learned in all the things that I've done and all the classes and things that I've been exposed to and working with various coaches and, my time at the Harvard Business School that, it's really about the people. And again, the better, faster we can develop the team around us and have the best people and develop to their fullest potential, that just adds that much benefit to our clients. But then it comes back to our team, and that, everything that, they can do more challenging projects and they can make more money, and so it becomes a virtuous circle, right? If you really develop the people, you can do better things. And if you do better things, that comes back to the team. And so I don't use that moniker. I've thrown it out a couple times, but it's really become sort of my sort of mission and vision in life is, how can I help the people around me be the best they can be?
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it makes perfect sense. And you also shared with me a couple of things that you thought were some key lessons that you learned out of the whole financial meltdown. One of them was that to diversify out of Michigan, to expand the approach that SME was taking in all the areas of business that you operate in. So construction and materials testing, geotechnical, environmental facilities. One of the things that you saw as a real opportunity for you guys was to diversify outside of Michigan. And what was your first inclination that was a real possibility?
Lots of discussions from the team. So I think, it's funny, we've had these discussions a lot about focus versus diversity, right? In terms of, do you stay really narrowly focused on certain clients and certain people, or do you add diversity to reduce your risk and to provide better perspective and that kind of thing? And somehow you have to be able to handle and manage and understand both of those. Because if you try to do too many things too far away, you can get into trouble. If all your eggs are in one basket, you can get into trouble, right? And we had a lot of these discussions, particularly, and this is one of the major items that we sort of focused on early in our strategic planning, was we were looking and saying, especially back in the 2000s, we were solely in Michigan. Michigan was hurting. The rest of the economy was doing well. We're like, we're stuck in a down market, right? So we're sitting there going, how do we diversify out of this region and really look at, we tried to say, why are we good here? What makes us special in Michigan? And it was, we really looked and said, hey, we seem to be really good with our clients in, call it, older cities that have lots of development and redevelopment opportunities, and where we can do brownfields and environmental, and they have foundation issues and that kind of thing. So we really looked around and said, hey, where are the other cities around here that are like the big cities in Michigan, right? So places like Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati and Indianapolis became very obvious choices for us. And we also looked at the nature of our business and said, part of our business is very location centric. The construction testing, you have to be there to do the work. And some of our business is transportable. You can, go far away and take it with you. And when we looked at what gave us value to our clients and also for ourselves in Michigan, was having offices nearby that could help each other and support each other. And so we had long discussions about, should we jump to Florida, or should we jump to Texas, or should we jump these other places? And one of the things we said is that, that's great. It's a booming market, but it will be much more difficult to support each other at that distance, especially for our services that are more local based, like the geotechnical where we're drilling, or the construction testing. So it sort of became obvious to us at that point during the planning that we should just keep moving to large metropolitan areas in the region as a strategy. And that's how that came about. And so we went through a series of steps, and we learned some things along the way. We started up some offices. We did some cold starts. We purchased a firm in Cleveland back in 2012, as I mentioned. And so we tried different things to see how we could do that. And, we were, I don't have the exact numbers, but at some point we were pretty much 100% in Michigan, or probably 95% in Michigan with 10% out. And I think now we're doing 20+% in Ohio and Indiana with another 10% outside. So we've moved the needle in that, and it's added, we've added staff and we've added diversity from a geography standpoint. And at the same time, we tried to add services in those locations, again, to try to add some diversity that way, so that we could add a little bit more stability to our work and not be impacted by solely one industry like automotive is here in Detroit.
Thanks for listening to the Build and Revitalize podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the Build and Revitalize podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting platform of choice, so you don't miss out on any of our future episodes. Don't forget to visit sme-usa.com and click on the Resources tab to listen to other episodes of the podcast and access our show notes. You can also connect with SME USA on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. See you next time.